Welcome to the track overview for the Future of Work track. I'm Gary Bolles. I'm the Care for the Future Work with Singularity University, co-founder of eParachute.com, and a partner in Charrette LLC, which is the producer of this event. Now, I hope that you weren't just staying here because it was easy to not click on another link. I hope that you also have looked at the other track opportunities, Future of Learning, Hacking HR, and entrepreneurship, and made sure that this is the one you want to hear about. But I'm happy to walk you through what we're planning for the day. I'd give you a little bit of a taste of some of my perspective on the future of work. Now, why am I fascinated by this topic? Well, it just so happens that when I was a teenager and not all that interested in college, I barely escaped high school, I sort of fell into the family business. And it turns out that my father was a recovering minister who became very, very interested in careers and helping people to be able to figure out what their next step in their work and their lives might be. And he ended up writing a book called What Color is Your Parachute, which became the world's enduring career manual. And I was actually trained in his methods when I was 19 years old. And so I was training, imagine you're 19 years old, you're training people in their 40s and 50s how to think about going through career shifts. And so I became fascinated with why we work and how we choose the ways that we work. But I found that what I was passionate about was technology. I loved high tech. And so I moved to Silicon Valley. I've worn pretty much every hat you can wear here, but had this enduring interest in the ways that we work. And a number of years ago, started a software company with my father, who passed away 4 years ago, but left behind an amazing legacy. And over time, I've become more and more focused on issues related to the future of work, the future of learning, and the future of the organization. And so that's where a significant amount of my portfolio of work is nowadays. So work is, no question, is going through a pretty significant shift. As a matter of fact, the rhetoric, the story we told ourselves about work in, say, January 2020 was that robots and software were going to change all the jobs and make a lot of jobs go away. And every new job was going to be dependent upon technology. And then, of course, along came a virus. So in January 2020, the future of work was mostly theory, just things we were talking about. And then by April of 2020, it became practice. So many people around the world were suddenly working remotely, or what John O'Dwyn, who will be speaking later in his book, Distributed Teams, calls distributed work. And so many of us were learning remotely, or in what is often called hybrid learning. And so I believe what we've done is we've started to reshape what I call the next rules of work as we're speaking. And so what I wanted to do was to walk you through why we've broken down the different topics that we have for this track, what the issues behind each of them are, and encourage you to dial in for each of these sessions throughout the day. Now, I'm going to interrupt myself at some point when a special guest is going to join me. Vint Cerf, whom I'll introduce when he arrives, is quite literally a legend in his own time. One of the co-founders, co-developers of the original protocols, and right on time. Here's Vint. Just starting to introduce you. So, it is such an honor to have you here, Vint. So as I was explaining to people, so not only did you and Bob Kahn come up with the underlying protocols, the software that runs the rules for how many of us today are managing our lives and our activities through this thing called the internet. But you have been a catalyst and an instigator to focus on the core issues that we need to focus on, like connectivity for all the humans throughout the world, as well as you've also been focused on issues related to work, and especially through the group I4J. So welcome, thank you for coming. And
well, thank you for inviting me, Gary. You know, as you know, these topics are all of great interest to me. And I want to emphasize, by the way, that when you do anything on the scale of the internet, you had a lot of help. And I've had literally, you know, I'm sure that it's millions of people who have contributed to the internet's success. And that, in a way, is a success of the design of the system. It was so open to people's ideas and opportunity to invent new applications, new protocols, new layers like the World Wide Web showing up, plopping down right on top of TCP/IP. So I'm actually very proud of the fact that we designed something knowing ahead of time that we were not going to figure out everything, but we wanted everybody else to help us do it and make it possible for them to do that. And so here we are. We're still 4 billion people short of getting everyone online, which is a big challenge as I see it anyway. Much work still to be done. And yet it feels like we are on our way. And then there are lots and lots of things in progress, including low Earth orbiting satellites like Starlink and others to increase connectivity and accessibility. But I think we also want to talk about what is the impact of these technologies on the society that we live in. And not to go on and on too much, but I want to mention that when we started the Internet Society way back in 1992, I can't speak for others, but I know I felt as if the Internet would create a society that would arise out of this, this basic infrastructure. And what's actually happened, I think, is plural. I mean, there are multiple societies that have arisen out of this. And most obviously, of course, the ones that divide up into different political camps or other kinds of interests that have created many, not one global village, but many villages, and people are allowed to be residents, so to speak, of more than one, which is one of the nice things about the way networking works. So there's plenty to talk about, I'm sure, and I'll let you lead the conversation. And if I get bored, of course, I'll just raise a bunch of issues in order to stimulate further discussion.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine you getting bored, Vint, but because you're fascinated by so many things. But I'll do my best to try to meet that bar. So if you start to yawn, then I'll know I need to up my game. So, and he's gone. So
Yeah.
But Vint, you hit on a couple of the key points that we need to cover anyway. So the first is what you often are called first principles or design principles, which is you and Bob. What you try to do is to say, now wait a minute, how can we make this thing as open and as much, how can people stand on the shoulders? You were thinking of yourselves as giants then, but I certainly think of you as that. But how can people stand on these sort of basic layers of things that we create? I'm going to be hosting a workshop, a roundtable tomorrow, focused on what I call the skills genome, which is, I believe we're going to unlock human skills in the same way that we've unlocked the code of human DNA. And but that needs to has all the same first principles that you talked about, which is open design, open interconnectivity. Second is what you did was you didn't say, oh, here's a packet of information going from point A to point B. It should change when it crosses a country border. It should be a different kind of information. You created essentially this borderless infrastructure that allows us to think completely differently about how one human connects to another. When you and I, back in the 80s, it's going to date both of us, but back in the 80s, when you were keynoting at the Interconnectivity Conference, and I was keynoting at NetWorld, which was a little farther up the stack, focused on operating systems and applications, what we both were saying was, hey, this is kind of new. We've got this ability to be able to link one human to another. I used to do lectures all the time where we'd say, you're going to be eventually sending email to your grandmother. And I would get audiences in the 80s saying, you've got to be kidding me. My grandmother wouldn't know how to find a keyboard. So again, first principles, but then also creating it as this open infrastructure. Now, where I think we've learned a tremendous amount about how we interconnect things is in the context of work. And because that's so many of the people are going to be focusing on this track, it's one of the things they're focusing on. I want to understand, how did you develop your interest? We both are good friends with David Nordfors, who is the founder of the I4J forum, which is an amazing community, one of the rare self-perpetuating communities on the internet of people all focused on issues related to the future of work. What drove your initial interest in that, and why did you want to dive in so much in helping people to be able to formulate approaches around human work?
Well, I have to blame David Nordfors for this. I can't claim too much credit. David had been interested in innovation in journalism and and journalism about innovation. And we met and worked for about 8 years together on that topic. He was at Stanford. And then as that project came to an end, he began speculating about innovation for jobs. How is it that that innovation affects work and the kinds of work that people are needed to do? And so we began exploring that question, and he had a remarkable connectivity with lots of people because of his earlier work in the journalism space. And so he drew upon a lot of those people and pulled them together into the Innovation for Jobs organization, which, as you say, has been self-perpetuating in terms of amazing, continued, vigorous discussion and debate. So we were trying to understand more deeply and wanted to consult with lots of people about how jobs would change. We knew that innovation would kill some jobs. I mean, it's happened historically. That's happened during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, as an example. But what has happened, of course, is every time you introduce new technology, you introduce new problems that need to be solved, new work that needs to be done. But it requires skills that you might not have and you need to learn in order to do the new jobs. And for the people whose jobs have been supernumerary or superannuated or whatever, the question is, can they be retrained? Are they willing to be retrained? And can they be retrained to do new work? And the answer is, well, sometimes yes and sometimes not. But there's no question in my mind there is new work to do. This is coupled together with another phenomenon, which I know you know about, Gary, and that's the evident extension of lifetime as a result of sanitation, medical care, and other kinds of social phenomena, social and economic phenomena have extended our lifetimes by a factor of 2 relative to what it was at the beginning of the 20th century. And let's imagine, just for the sake of argument, that everybody nominally would live to 100. That there are implications of that, quite apart from the size of population and so on. But just imagine, today we typically have people going to school until they're in their early 20s. Maybe a little later if you're studying for an advanced thing like medical degrees or legal degrees, maybe it's 25 or 26. But imagine living to 100 and having a job span of 60 or 70 years. Well, you can easily imagine that over 60 to 70 years, a whole bunch of new technology would come along, which didn't exist when you were getting educated. And so the implication is that you're going to have to learn new things in order to be productive and useful, which means that just going to school at the beginning of your life is not enough. And you have to keep learning. And I know this is an old cliche, lifelong learning, but it is a real requirement as you look at a career that lasts that long. And so that means that we can't stick with the current paradigms. We can't stick with the residential, go to school for 4 years or 8 years or whatever it is. It's not necessarily that you have to go online, although that's going to be helpful, because you need to be able to get the education while you're still working. So my sense is that our delivery of education, our delivery of learning has got to change. And I'm seeing it already happen among young people who often don't bother going to Google, I'm sorry to say. Instead, they go to YouTube, which I guess I'm okay with because that's another Google company. But the kids have discovered that if they don't know how to do something, if they go to YouTube and they say, how do I do X? Somebody's made a video of how to do it. And I've experienced that personally. I wanted to make Chinese eggplant once. We didn't have a clue. So I went to YouTube and said, how do I make Chinese eggplant? I got 17 videos. So we watched 3 and went off and got those long, skinny, gray, eggplants from Chinese eggplants. And we made a very credible Chinese eggplant thanks to instructions on YouTube. So the point here is that this just-in-time learning idea is actually manifest already. And presumably it will elaborate over the course of the next several decades as the need arises. So I'll stop there and see whether or not it resonates.
No. You hit all the key points. So in the book Next Rules of Work, I say I call this just-in-time learning and just-in-context. It's just in time because you didn't go back to cooking school to learn how to cook Chinese eggplant. You looked at a video. And just in context, you didn't do it 6 months ahead of time and then hope that someday you'd have the opportunity to cook it. You did it just as you're about to. Now, I don't want my brain surgeon to just have watched a YouTube video and walk into the operating theater. There's some
Yeah.
wine that you should not sell before it's time. But there are many things, as you say, especially younger people are doing where, because I think of work as essentially being human skills applied to tasks to solve problems. It's all about solving problems. They encounter a problem, they go online, they try to find somebody else who has solved the problem. If somebody else hasn't actually solved that problem, they figure it out and then they record the video. So then they're the creator of that solution. And increasingly, this is how our fabric of learning is going to change.
So just to pick up on this, isn't it interesting that somebody decided to make a video about how to solve that problem? Let me show you how to do X for some value of X. Why would people do that? And I think we're seeing the same phenomenon that triggered the avalanche of content that flowed into the World Wide Web when it was first introduced and became much more visible around 1993, 94. And I think part of the motivation there was it was satisfying to know that something you knew was useful to somebody else. It wasn't even a question of being remunerated or anything. The satisfaction that you helped somebody else is really alive and well. And so we are, in a sense, depending on that. The young people who are turning to YouTube are depending on the notion that someone else will want to share what they have discovered and solve. And I know that, you know, when I run into a problem with my laptop or my mobile or something, I often go to Google and I say, how do I do X? And it takes me to a YouTube video.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's, again, that borderless fabric. I mean, that could be a person who's learned how to cook Chinese eggplant who is half the world away from you. And but it's because we've essentially created this fabric that allows us to be able to have that connectivity.
So think a little bit now about how technology is helping us make this work better. One example is artificial intelligence, machine learning, the ability to translate one language into another, the ability to recognize speech and to respond by generating speech. All of those things are introducing accessibility tools, accommodations, and also allowing people to communicate who otherwise might not be able to. And it's just astonishing what we have learned to do with computers that are erasing barriers to access, useful access to information. There's still lots of barriers left, but for me anyway, it's just fascinating to see how powerful this technology can be.
Well, I think of it as friction, right? The old ways that we used to learn and work, they had a lot of frictions around them, and many of them place-based, and we've reduced a huge amount of that friction. As a matter of fact, one of our sessions today is focused on the intersection of artificial intelligence and work, hosted by Layla Toplik of NetHope. And she's going to explore a lot of these issues about the ways that it can be used to augment and enable human work and learning. And that's the framing I would like people to have the most is, you know, I was saying that pre-pandemic rhetoric around robots and software taking away jobs. Well, robots and software don't take away jobs. It's a human's decision if a job goes away. Robots and software just automate tasks. And so instead, if we think of the plus side of the equation, we start to get a whole bunch of those people in Arnovio's track on entrepreneurship that are starting companies to focus on helping humans to be able to develop their superpowers, to solve new problems, to augment their capacity. Now we've got something. So that's really, I think, so much of the opportunity with the technologies that you're talking about is to create a huge amount of value on the plus side of the equation for humans and their skills and work.
So you're echoing Douglas Engelbart, who is always talking about getting better and having communities that learn from each other. He was always talking about augmentation of human intellect through the addition of computing, which is exactly what we are seeing happening right now. Although, you know, I don't run away from the robotics notions because if things can be automated, sometimes that's very helpful. It's certainly a way of multiplying your capacity. Imagine sitting down and saying to a bunch of robots, let me show you how to do this, which is what we do. If you look at Elon Musk's Tesla plants, there's 160 some odd robots that are assembling these things. And there's still lots of people around who also have to be there to fix the robots or to program them or get them to do the right thing. Now, I do have to point out inescapably that by reducing barriers and reducing friction, we've made all these technologies readily available to everybody, including the bad guys, people who do not have your best interests at heart. And so now we have a problem because we have empowered everybody And now we have to figure out how to cope with the fact that harmful behaviors occur in this medium. And we have to be able to track down the perpetrators and deal with them, or make it harder for them to behave this way, while at the same time not losing all of the value of enabling that the technologies have allowed for what you and I think we consider to be more constructive activity. So
No,
we
absolutely.
have to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you and I in the 80s and then in the 90s, when you were talking about the Internet Society, we had a very utopian vision. Or, I actually used to be the editorial director of Network Computing Magazine. And in 1993, we did a cover story called The Internet Gold Rush. And we envisioned this amazing connectivity era of the world. And we said, oh, but, ads, they won't fly. People aren't going to love ads. Nobody likes ads on the internet at the time. And yet here we have lots and lots of ads. Turns out it's the business model that fuels a huge amount of innovation. But you're right, with the technologies, as far as I'm concerned, throughout history, we've had technologies going back to weaving machines that have enabled humans to be able to do less mundane work. We just have to design for the future that is inclusive and that ensures people will either have access to meaningful, well-paid work, or will have the agency and the opportunity to be able to create new work and creating new organizations.
So here's an example that we've learned from the pandemic. I'm sure many of the people who are listening and participating in this event will recognize this scenario where the doctor says, don't come into the office because I don't have any protective equipment, but I'm happy to do a video call. And of course, I'm sitting here saying, what kind of medicine is that? You didn't take my pulse, you didn't take my weight, you didn't take my heart rate or any, pulse ox and all the other. What about those my temperature? What about those important measurements? And of course, the answer to that may be devices, medical sensory devices that we'll call part of the Internet of Things that you can have at home and provide that information remotely to the doctor. And so those are new things that are being invented, partly as a consequence of the pandemic and the separation that we had to observe, but it also has a lasting potential to make remote medicine real. And where in the past it has been very hard to achieve that objective. And so there's a silver lining hiding in here in the midst of this very dark pandemic experience.
No, absolutely. And it's the same thing with distributed work. It's the same thing with hybrid learning. We did a lot of these things in kind of panic mode. Now we have the opportunity to actually do them right. And it's not that we weren't talking about these big shifts. Some of the I4J conferences that you and I spoke at, for years, we've been saying we're going to have these big shifts. And yet it took the response to the virus to actually trigger them. And so what we've ended up doing for Global Skills Day today to try to hit some of these themes is we've got a session on distributed work. As you mentioned, we've got a session on AI and work. We also want to make sure people are understanding, and thank you for using the word training. I don't use the word reskilling, upskilling, outskilling. Those sound like the industrial era processes we're trying to leave behind. And it's okay if people use them, that's fine. But we do have a session called Work Reimagined that Angela Jackson from New Profit is going to be chairing. That is a range of innovators that have been competing for the X Prize for rapid reskilling. And then finally, we've got an amazing session on policy for the future of work. So we can kind of deal at the macro level of how to enable these big shifts in the world of work. And then finally, new skills training, like how you were talking about the process of actually learning those new skills. We've got a session on that as well.
Can I just interrupt for a second? I just realized a very interesting phenomenon. When you change the medium, you may not realize that what you've done is to create new paradigms for using and experiencing learning. So as an example, you think about online and you think, okay, so that just means I don't have to go into the classroom. Well, that's not entirely right, because if the result is recorded, it means that you can watch more than once. You'd never get the lecturer to repeat himself or herself, but you can do that on your own. So this idea of being in control and being able to choose a way in which you are learning is a consequence of the medium, because of the pre-recording, for example, or the ability to simply take an interactive course as many times as you want to. And so the opportunities open up. It's a little bit like doing the old thing in a new way, followed by, oh, now that you're doing it this way, there's a bunch of other things you could do that you couldn't do the old way. This is the consequence of digitizing things, for example, is amazing, because once it's digitized, you can apply computer software to the digital content in ways that you could never do on your own. Think about indexing the entire World Wide Web and allowing anybody, including you and me, to go find stuff in this enormous pile of digital material. Couldn't do it if it hadn't been digitized.
No, absolutely. No, I think great insights, and especially because as you're talking about sort of changing the paradigm, and especially on things like learning, one of our sessions in the Future of Learning track, Esther Wojcicki is going to be talking about learning at scale. But she's the author of the book Moonshots in Education, and she talks about just completely flipping the equation from the teacher being the sage on the stage to being the guide on the side, and actually the student, the learner, much better word, is actually the one that is empowered and enabled to be able to guide their own learning and to do that on a collaborative basis. And sure, again, in the pandemic reaction, we had to sort of just figure out how to just keep the classroom moving forward. But we have a tremendous opportunity to reshape how we think about how we learn, and not just in a traditional school environment, but in our organizations as well.
You know, when you pointed out the context of learning, there's an amazing element of motivation hiding in that phrase, because if you're trying to solve an immediate problem, then you have a very clear metric for why you're learning it. It's so you can solve a problem. Whereas sitting in a classroom learning, how to do, calculus or something, there's no specific motivation necessarily behind that. It's sort of a very pastos kind of motivation. But if you're confronted with a particular problem you're trying to solve, I'm trying to fix this thing, or I'm trying to make that thing, then you have a metric of success that's very clear. Either you did it or you didn't. And did this help me do it or not? And so the quality of the learning material or the teaching material gets evaluated against very, very clear parameters, as opposed to some very general kind of notion of do I know more now than I did before?
Yeah, absolutely. So Vint, we've only got just a couple of minutes left, but I just want to hit 2 points. One is Rick Patello has put in the questions. I'm just going to give him a brief answer. He wanted to know, since we're having all these amazing conversations throughout the day, how can this conference help to build learning communities going forward? Rick, that's actually something I want to address in our final session. We're going to have a wrap up with our track chairs. But basically what we want to do is we want this to spark the dialogue, and then we want to do a series of what we call salons afterwards. And then Hamoun Akhtari asks a great question that I know he'd love to just get your quick take on, which is basically, given looking at the horse analogy, well, we don't ride a lot of horses anymore. The horses didn't actually develop the skills that allowed them to stay relevant. What about humans? I mean, are humans going to continually be able to have the relevant skills, even with the support of AI going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we are learning that we can use these technologies to augment our capabilities. We will use these as tools. We are not the tools. We are the users of those tools, and they will, as Doug Engelbart points out, augment our capacity. That's been happening all the time. It will continue to happen. We will still be relevant. We will still have brilliant new ideas, and the excitement continues.
Yeah. Now, Vint, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to ask you one important question. I give you a magic wand. You can wave it and you can ensure one thing is going to happen for the future of work for humans. You can ensure that there's one way that we're going to ensure that we're going to have that inclusive future for humans. What is it? What's the thing you would use your magic wand for?
Well, from the chief internet evangelist at Google, I would wave my wand. Everyone has access to affordable, reliable, safe, secure, and private internet access, and everything that it supports. Poof.
Done. How hard can that be? So, well, Vint, it's been an amazing experience for me. It's a privilege to have you with us. I know I've seen on the chat, people are saying what a privilege it is to be able to hear from you and to have you be so knowledgeable about these issues, especially as related to the issues for the future of work and the future of learning. I hope that we're all able to actually make the future that you're talking about happen. I hope that is one of the actions that we'll take out of this, is that commitment to be able to ensure that all humans can have the basic access to the work and learning opportunities that so many others have.
I hope so too.
All
Great
right.
to see you, Gary. Thanks for having me on the show.
All right, take care. I hope to see you again soon. All right, so for those of you who are watching, now we're going to take a 10-minute break. You've got an opportunity to be able to hop into breakout sessions for each of the tracks. And so I want to encourage you to, again, look at the agenda and to be able to pick out of each of the tracks the ones that the session that fascinates you the most. Again, you're going to have the bit.ly links. You can go on the website, click on the links on the agenda there, or you can click on your PDF version of the agenda. We'll see you after the 10-minute break. All right, be well.
Bye-bye. You too, Gary. Bye for now.